All right, everyone, welcome to Pac-12 Breakdown. It's another Wednesday, and we're joined by Nick Dempsey from Rule of Three and also Conquest Chronicles. We've got Keelan Jones on the line from House of Sparky. Hey, guys, how are you?
Pretty good. How about yourself?
Doing just fine. So I'm kind of excited about this. It's a fun discussion. So what we're doing during this little dead time between National Signing Day and spring practice is we're matching up the Power 5 conferences. And I think both of you would certainly be on the side of the Pac-12 being possibly the deepest league in college football. We'll see how you feel. So this is certainly non-scientific, but we're going to take the Pac-12 against the other four leagues over the next 4 weeks, and we're going to match them up. So I've got this seeded, and it doesn't necessarily go with what some people's opinions are about the best team through the 10th or 12th best team, but based on conference record, overall record, and if there's a tie, a head-to-head matchup, these are the seedings for the two leagues. So we're going to start Pac-12, Big 12, and when I get your take on these games, and I'm going to throw mine in as well, I'm going to let you know what the Big 12 bloggers had to say about these 10 matchups when I had them on last week. So let's start with the big one-seed game here. We got Stanford, who just narrowly missed the college football playoff against an Oklahoma team that squeaked into the college football playoff and was handed a rather humbling loss by Clemson, Nick. So we've got Oklahoma taking on Stanford. This would obviously be a pretty fun one to watch.
Yeah, this would be a dream matchup, and we're almost kind of touching on a debate I think the committee largely avoided. Do you take a two-loss team that's looking a little more impressive, or do you take the team with a better record and maybe didn't have the strong conference championship finish? I don't want to overweight the final results in their last game. Obviously, if you did that, Oklahoma looked very weak in the championship game, and Stanford looked incredibly strong, thumping Iowa. But I don't think Oklahoma would have an answer for Christian McCaffrey. They didn't seem to have one when they played Clemson. And as good as that Oklahoma offense is, if you don't have an answer for Christian McCaffrey, that David Shaw in that offense is just going to dominate the time of possession. And it's going to be really hard for Oklahoma to score if their offense isn't on the field. I don't think it'll be as lopsided as, say, Stanford versus Iowa or Clemson over Oklahoma, but I think Stanford would probably win that game.
All right, Kalen, neutral site, the Sooners and the Cardinal.
I'd have to agree with what Nick just had to say in regards to having Christian McCaffrey with a reloaded Stanford offensive line. Granted, they lost two of the best offensive linemen in the country when you're talking about Joshua Garnett and Kyle Murphy. But looking again, like Nick pointed out, Oklahoma's defense, they lose a pretty important player in Eric Stryker as well as Zach Sanchez in the secondary. Regardless of who's starting under center for Stanford, I think when you're considering, again, whose style of play will be more physically imposing, and the edge would definitely favor Stanford in that aspect. And again, you have a Heisman candidate, arguably the player who should have won the Heisman Trophy last season, in Christian McCaffrey. As Nick pointed out, as loaded as Oklahoma is, I mean, they got a great backfield and then stud quarterback play when you're talking about Baker Mayfield. They've lost some weapons as well when you're talking about Sterling Shepard. I think Stanford definitely has an edge in that matchup.
I don't know that it changes the equation that much, but we're going to go back to 2015 since we really don't know the impact of the signing classes and the change in personnel from year to year. So just kind of technically, I'm looking at 2015's personnel, so everybody that's moving on to the NFL or graduation losses, they suit up one more time and we bring them back for an April game here. Oklahoma and Stanford. I think one of the keys that I would see is that although Baker Mayfield is extremely mobile, he was sandwiched in and punished against Clemson. I don't think Stanford's defensive front is quite as athletic and freakishly athletic, but I think that they would be very effective against Oklahoma in showing that the Sooners' pass protection had some serious breakdowns in that game. I'm right on there. On par with you guys in regards to just liking Stanford's just ability to execute a very tight game plan. I think they're a more disciplined football team than Oklahoma, and I just think they have very few weaknesses, if any, where Oklahoma has some glaring spots that showed up against the better team. So we got a clean sweep with Stanford over Oklahoma. All right. I don't think a whole lot of Big 12 supporters would like this second matchup. I don't know that Oklahoma State's the second best team in the Big 12 from 2015, but that's the way it lined up. The Cowboys won their first 10 games, ran into some better opponents, and then specifically in the Sugar Bowl, just ran through the buzzsaw against the Rebels of Ole Miss, losing in a big way. Oregon, of course, had the big collapse against TCU when they lost Vernon Adams Jr. I guess that evened the equation since TCU was missing Trevon Boykin, but this could be an interesting matchup with a lot of scoring. Oklahoma State, Nick, against Oregon.
Yeah, Oklahoma State really fell off hard the last, 3 games where they just, and it's not even that they'd lost 3 straight, it's that they got thumped 3 straight times. So not a strong finish. On the other hand, Oregon seemed to start kind of, had a shaky start and then got it together as the year went on. But I think anytime you're talking about Oregon, at least in 2015, you're really talking about how well is Vernon Adams playing and is he healthy. When Vernon Adams is on and he's playing well, Oregon can compete with anyway just about anybody in the country. When he's not, it feels like just about anybody has a shot at beating Oregon. And I think that's what we're really looking at here. I would have to take probably Oregon, especially because Oklahoma State, when the pressure got turned up against the better teams, they fell apart. But having said that, it depends on, what are we looking at with Vernon Adams. If he shows up, yeah, absolutely take Oregon. If not, Oklahoma State has a chance for sure. But I think I would definitely take Oregon in this matchup.
All right, Kalen, we got Oklahoma State, losers of 3 consecutive games to close out 2015 against Oregon, and I probably should have done a much better job of setting up the rules here. So we got 2015 teams, and we also are going to assume that they're at full strength. So maybe if a guy missed the entire 2015, maybe we throw him out. But we're sizing up these teams at full strength. The starting quarterbacks, the whole deal for both of these squads.
Well, yeah, if you're talking about Oregon at full strength with Vernon Adams last season, I think you definitely have to take them over Oklahoma State. Granted, I don't want to be someone who, puts too much stake into what have you done for me lately, but considering what Oregon was able to do over the course of the final stretch of the year when Vernon Adams was healthy, and in comparison to what Oklahoma State did towards the end of the season, I think you definitely have to look at Oregon, the playmakers that they have aside from Vernon Adams. If you're considering a healthy Byron Marshall, not Dwayne Washington, he plays for Oklahoma State, but a full complement of receivers for Oregon, and then on top of that, you're looking at defensively. Emmanuel Ogba is definitely a great player, but Oregon's offensive line is considerably better, at least in my opinion, compared to what Oklahoma State has, and then they'd have to be dealing with arguably the best player in the country last season in DeForest Buckner. So I definitely go with Oregon in that matchup as well.
Yeah, down the stretch again, Oklahoma State losing to Baylor by 10 points. That was a home game. They also had Oklahoma at home and were completely annihilated in a game that decided the Big 12 championship and then got steamrolled against Ole Miss. I think that this Oklahoma State team overachieved. I think we saw it down the stretch. I don't think they have nearly the talent that Oregon does. I think that's one of the clear, easier choices for me on the board. I think the Ducks win this one by a couple scores at least at full strength against Oklahoma State. So it appears as though the Pac-12 is off to a great start here, fellas, when we look at the first 2 matchups here. This next one, a bit more difficult, I believe, with TCU, a team that to be reckoned with, especially if they're at full strength with Josh Doxson, who was injured late in the season at wide receiver, one of the best in the business, Trevon Boykin at quarterback. They had a myriad of injuries on defense for most of the season, but when they were at full strength, we saw what they did against Oregon, and that was minus Boykin. Against a Washington State team that, again, I like to remind people, and I know I don't need to remind you two, if they don't miss the field goal against the Pac-12 championship game, and they took it to Miami and played a rather good game down in El Paso to conclude the season. So, Nick, what do you think about TCU and Washington State, a game that we wouldn't necessarily anticipate going into 2015 that it would be seeded this way?
Yeah, definitely not. I would love to watch this game play out because, there'd be so many points. It's just a ridiculous. Take the over. I'm not even a Vegas expert, but take the over, whatever it is. This one's interesting because, we don't normally think of Washington State as sort of a dominant team, like you said. I don't think anyone really thought they'd be up there near the top of the Pac-12 North. But yet they were very competitive, and again, they were a kick away from beating the Pac-12 champions. On the other hand, TCU can score a lot of points. They're a ridiculously talented offense against a Washington State defense that's not terribly difficult to score against, usually. So I think it pains me to pick against Washington State because last year they just kept winning games that I didn't think they were going to. But I think TCU would probably pull it out. This feels like it could be one of those games where, like, the last possession, whoever has the ball last is probably going to win. But, man, that'd be a fun game to watch. It'd probably be something ridiculous like 56-52 or something like that. But I think TCU, I think they just have more talent, particularly on defense, that I think would really give them an edge. So it would come down to a possession, maybe one random turnover, but I definitely think TCU would take it.
Yeah, Washington State had a streak last year that really fooled Vegas, where it was like 3 or 4 consecutive weeks that they not only won as an underdog, they won as a double-digit underdog 3 or 4 consecutive times last year. That is just unheard of. TCU, extremely talented. Kalen taking on Washington State with Luke Falk at quarterback.
I'd actually have to agree with Nick here, even though I was trying not to copy exactly what he said. But, again, I mean, you're looking at a TCU team at full strength. They have more playmakers when you talk about Aaron Green, Javon Boykin, Josh Doxson. As much as I love what Washington State was able to do this season, and granted, I agree with Nick, like it'd be fun to watch them, and it's hard to root against them. But when you consider that they were primarily a passing offense where they really had no semblance of running the football, TCU's defense, I mean, granted, they aren't the best. They're a Big 12 team, excuse me. They concede a lot of points, but at the same time, if Luke Falk makes any mistakes, I feel like I'd take Javon Boykin and a full complement of weapons in comparison to Luke Falk and what he has on his offensive side.
Hey, Kalen, unless Nick corrects me here, I believe we lost your video feed. It looks like you're back now. Okay.
Yeah.
The audio was crystal clear, so we're
sorry about that.
But you're back, but I'm kind of losing the feed when you pop up on the full screen. Anyway, so let's go down to our 4-seed game, and even though that Oklahoma-Stanford game is the marquee game because of those two teams winning the conference championship last year, this might be the game I want to see more than any other game. USC and Baylor, and I guess I forgot to give you my TCU Washington State pick. I just don't think, for many of the reasons that you both cited, Washington State hangs in late against TCU. I think it's an entertaining game beyond belief. But I think TCU, more athletic, just better recruited on defense, and I think that's one of the reasons why Washington State was a 9 or 10 win team last year, is because the defense wasn't great, but it was much higher on the in regards to quality than your typical Washington State defense. They weren't getting totally annihilated, but TCU just a little bit too good for Washington State there. I see them winning by 10 to 14 points. All right, we got Baylor and USC, Nick. This would be an entertaining game. I know USC doesn't have its program where they would like it and believe they should be. Lost 5 games last year. This Baylor team beat North Carolina in a bowl game without a starting quarterback, best wide receiver, best running back, and finished at 10-3. So we got the Bears and the Trojans.
This would be a good matchup, and I think you'd see a lot of interesting styles, actually, because I'm thinking about that USC secondary. And we saw them show up and play a great game against Josh Rosen and UCLA. But we also saw them play Oregon, and they got torched. I mean, at times it looked like they weren't even playing the same sport. It was bad. So you take that Baylor offense against that USC secondary, and Baylor could score a lot of points. Now, on the other side, I know some folks might have questions about Baylor's defense or where that's at, but honestly, USC, I don't see them being able to keep pace with Baylor's offense. I really don't. I know USC lately, towards the end of the year, really loved running the ball 40-plus times a game, so that could help keep Baylor's offense off the field a little bit. But I think Baylor would probably be a little bit too much for USC to keep pace with.
All right, I got pretty much the same thoughts. Again, Baylor, I was astonished against North Carolina without the starting quarterback, without the backup quarterback, with the third-string quarterback who basically didn't throw the ball. They ran a wildcat the entire game, racked up like 560 yards or some ridiculous amount of rushing against North Carolina. When they're at full strength, and again, Corey Coleman and Katie Cannon, two of the best wide receivers in college football, maybe the best tandem wide receivers in college football in 2015, one of them moving on to the NFL. I think Baylor would be a little bit too much for USC, but that would be the game, if I could only see one, that I would want to see. So I've got Baylor as well. We'll wait for Kalen to come on the line and just continue on down the line. And
I don't know if you guys can hear me or not.
I got you.
Yeah, we got you.
I can't jump back on for some reason. I don't know what happened, but
that's fine. We'll take the audio here. It's crystal clear. So we got Baylor and USC, Kalen.
Yeah, I heard you guys talking about it. But I definitely agree with what Nick had to say when you're looking at what Oregon did to USC. It's hard not to think about Baylor doing the same thing with the type of performance or touchdown machine that Corey Coleman was last year. And Jared Stidham is starting and not injured again. I think Baylor would provide some type of menace for USC. But if you catch them on a good day, I think USC would actually put up a considerably better fight than what they did against Oregon. And granted, in that game, they actually only ended up by or at least made it a competitive game towards the end of the game. So I think it's more of a toss-up than I think we assume, but I'd still lean towards Baylor.
So through 4 matchups, we have a consensus on every game. So we'll have to mix that up a little bit, and the Big 12 is making a bit of a comeback here in the last 2 matchups. So let's drop it down to the 5 seeds with Utah, who obviously got off to a blazing start with impressive wins over Michigan and Oregon early in the season, taking on West Virginia, a team that, along with Arizona State, posted one of the more entertaining bowl games to kind of salvage the bowl season as the last bowl game in defeating Arizona State 43-42. So we got defense and running game with Devontae Booker back on the field for Utah, taking on West Virginia, Nick.
When Booker was on the field last year, Utah was incredibly difficult to beat. In fact, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think really the only time Utah lost last year was either when Booker was injured or when he was taken out of the game because Utah fell too far behind. That's a huge part of the reason why USC was able to beat Utah is because they got up early and Utah had to pass more and they couldn't rely on Booker. So when he's on, when he's healthy, I really like Utah. I think West Virginia did underachieve this year. I think they could have done better than the record indicated. But if they get Booker going, Utah is really difficult to beat. And in fact, if Booker doesn't get injured, Utah is almost certainly in the Pac-12 championship game, and we could have seen a great Utah-Stanford matchup. So I think, if we're going full strength versus full strength, Booker's in the game. I got to go with Utah on this one.
Hey, Kalen, it seems as though we've got a team or two like this in every conference where they beat everybody they're supposed to beat and lose to the top teams. And West Virginia was that team in the Big 12. If you look at Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, Baylor, TCU, they got throttled for the most part. They beat the marginal and lesser teams in the Big 12. They take on a Utah team that was as high as number 3 in the country, faltered down the stretch, hung on against BYU in the Las Vegas Bowl to finish at 10-3.
I'm really struggling to find any type of different analysis from what Nick's posing. But I mean, he basically hit it on the head. Devontae Booker, if he's healthy, it makes all the difference. I don't think West Virginia would have been able to match up at all with what Utah would be able to do offensively. But at the same time, they would be able to get back Carl Joseph alongside KJ Dillon. So the secondary would be great. But again, Utah's whole offensive mindset is predicated on rushing the football, and it's built through what Devontae Booker can do. If he's healthy, I don't think Utah's losing to West Virginia.
And that's a great point, Caitlin. Carl Joseph, one of the very best DBs in college football, lost early for the Mountaineers. So we got West Virginia, Utah. We got a clean sweep for Utah. We're going defense. We're going running game. I think that front 7 for Utah would do some damage against West Virginia. But the limitations passing the football for Utah against Skyler Howard and West Virginia passing attack that is pretty stellar would be interesting and keep it close in my estimation. All right, we bring it down to the number 6 matchup with Texas Tech. Lots of offense, no defense against the Washington team that's pretty much the opposite. You're talking about a brutal front 7 on defense and a team that struggled to score points most of the time, Nick.
Yeah, this one's tough for me to read in large part because Washington has just had an interesting season. and they're tough to peg. They come out and they beat teams that no one thought they should, like USC, and then they also come out and lose to teams that they probably shouldn't have, or had a chance to beat and didn't follow through. Texas Tech is another one of those teams that, again, they couldn't hang with the best teams in their conference, and kind of struggled in the middle of the pack there. I don't know. This is a tough one for me. I want to say Washington because I think they're a program on the rise, but their struggle to score points. I think Texas Tech probably takes it, I want to say, but man, that would just be an interesting matchup to watch.
All right, Kalen, we got two teams that are on opposite ends of the spectrum when we look at offense and defense.
Yeah, and it would be a great matchup to see. I think Nick pointed out it would be a tough matchup to watch, but I think Texas Tech definitely presents a formidable opponent, especially when you're talking about what Washington's defense is able to do, the young studs that they have in their secondary. I think it would pose a lot of trouble for Patrick Mahomes and co. to really get anything going. And I think this is a matchup that Washington would not necessarily thrive in, but I think they'd kind of step up to the challenge. I think we saw throughout the season them kind of take on better opponents, like you guys pointed out, and really step up to the caliber of opponents that they're facing. I think this would be one of those matchups. Granted, they need their offense to actually contribute points and put something up on the board, but I think Washington's defense, I think it would be able to keep them in a game against a team that, granted, is able to put points up on the board almost at will, but I think they keep them competitive, and I think the offense will be able to do enough in that game.
We finally have some dissension here. 6 matchups into it. We got Washington for Dylan. We got Texas Tech for Nick. I struggled with this one for a lot of the reasons why that Nick described. That Washington, I usually go with defense and running game. That I just think that even though it could be ugly and you get maybe distracted by all the glossy numbers on offense and think, wow, that offense is going to score some points, that usually the defense pulls through and creates such havoc in the backfield and just makes it so difficult. But I just think that Texas Tech's defense would not be as exposed as it typically is against a decent offense with the issues that Washington had on that side of the football. I think Texas Tech with Pat Mahomes at quarterback, DeAndre Washington, a fine running back as well, and all the weapons they have would get it done, even though the defense is just atrocious against Washington. So I'm going with the Red Raiders against the Huskies here. So we got our first 2-1 split after 5 consecutive, but 3-0 whitewashings. Now we got some Texas-Arizona State action here with Texas losing against Cal. That was a game in which Texas came back late in the game, scored what could have been the game-tying touchdown, but missed the extra point, so 45-44, and they are going to rematch this year at Cal Berkeley. So Texas and Arizona State, Nick.
This has got to be like the frustrated fan base bowl, I think. 'Cause both of these teams, they should be better, and this last season they just weren't. If this were 10, 15 years ago, I would say, yeah, Texas would just throttle them. But this Texas team that we saw get, Cal went up big over them early in the game. Notre Dame just thumped Texas. That was rough to watch if you were a Texas fan. But Arizona State, where did they go? Finish 6-7. They should have been so much better. Their record should have been much better. But I don't know. I'm just not liking Texas. I'll let him go into more detail. But Texas is just struggling. They need to get it turned around. I think Arizona State would win. I think it would be a sloppy game, probably more turnovers and boneheaded plays than these teams are capable of making. But I think I got to go with Arizona State. I'm not on the Texas hype train.
All right, Kalen, I think Nick has set us up for a big breakdown. We're expecting a lot out of you with Arizona State on the board here.
Oh, man, there's not much to say considering he knocked it out again. This is a game where neither team would want – it looked like neither team was trying to win the game if both teams were on the field at the same time. With Arizona State, there's so many components to it. It's whether, they turn the ball over a lot. whether you execute. I feel like they should have, like Nick pointed out, been a better team, but I'm not going to get into that. I think on the Texas end, they definitely pose some. They have a considerable amount of talent that I feel when you're looking at the youth movement that they've had both offensively and defensively, you got to give it a minute to really develop. So I guess this season, if I were going to say based on 2015 and based on full strength, I go with Arizona State. But I think you give Texas a few years, they're trending more so in the right direction than what ASU is. I think this was the year that the Sun Devils were really supposed to peak as a team, and they didn't. So I guess based on what we're expecting, I'm going to go Arizona State.
Okay. I view this as almost a Texas Tech-Washington matchup, but less dramatic in the extremes, where Texas was just atrocious on offense at times. The passing game was bad. They got shut out by Iowa State. Texas just had some difficulties last season. It was just atrocious at times. They beat Oklahoma, though. So I am going to go with Texas to win this game. I just think that they're extremely sound on defense, and they'd slam it down Arizona State's throats on offense. And even though Arizona State's a little more dynamic on offense with Mike Bercovici at the controls, I'm going to go with Texas in a nail-biter over Arizona State. All right, now it starts to get ugly already. We got a Kansas State team that, again, they squeaked into bowl play, which I don't know what that's saying these days at 6-6. They got thumped by Arkansas. You got Arizona, who just got annihilated at times throughout its Pac-12 schedule when Scooby Wright and Anu Solomon weren't on the field, but they recovered to get to a bowl game and win one over New Mexico. So Kansas State and Arizona, Nick, try to handicap this one.
Yeah, you're right. It does really start to get ugly here. And I think you kind of alluded to it. Arizona was a different team when Anu Solomon and Scooby Wright were on the field, although that did not happen as much as they'd like. There were games where their losses, I think they were just a drive or two behind their opponents, and I believe they lost 38-30 to USC, but then there were also games where they just got demolished by Washington. Or Stanford, I believe, thumped them pretty hard too, and so did UCLA. So, if we see that Arizona team, God, it's tough to see them beating anyone. But on the other side, Kansas State, what did they win? They went like a 6-game losing streak against some average teams, some not so great teams, and they squeaked in to the bowl by beating. I believe they beat Iowa State, Kansas, and West Virginia, or something like that. So both of these teams just, this is rough. I want to go with Arizona when healthy. I think Solomon and Scooby Wright do a lot of damage there. But, man, if that Arizona team that showed up against UCLA or Stanford shows up against Kansas State, I would go Kansas State. But I think Arizona, when healthy, in an ugly one, probably wins by I want to say one score, maybe 7 to 10 points, somewhere in there.
All right, Caitlin, we got a matchup with Arizona and Kansas State where the stereotypes, and I think they fit for 2015, is that Kansas State overachieves. They didn't so much this past season, but it's just amazing with recruiting classes in the 60s and 70s that on occasion, and it's pretty frequent, they're winning 9 and 10 games and getting to pretty major bowl games, but couldn't quite reach that level this year, but still won their 6 games. Get to postseason play. Arizona, as Nick pointed out, I was surprised that they hung with USC because they were coming off a string of just atrocious outings, but most of that without Anu Solomon on the field. So we got Anu Solomon on the field, Nick Wilson, everybody that they lost for spurts last season on the field for the Wildcats, taking on the Wildcats. Wildcats and Wildcats, Caitlin.
You go Arizona in that matchup. Full strength, I think Anu Solomon, Nick Wilson, Scooby Wright, that trio, that's the type of core that, we were expecting to see really take them to the next level. I mean, it goes both ways. I'm not trying to bring Arizona State back into it, but, I mean, both Arizona teams, we were really expecting to take the next step considering the type of dynamic weapons that they had on both sides of the ball. And Arizona, when you're talking about Scooby Wright being a Heisman candidate just a year before and then being forcibly removed because of injury, I think it really hurt them. Obviously it did, but I think if you get a new Solomon, we saw what they can do with him under center and what type of different type of dynamic he brings for the offense. I think in comparison to Kansas State, granted they do show up against better opponents. I think this is a level or opponent that's more so on par, and I think Arizona would not necessarily run away with it, but win pretty comfortably.
Yeah, Nick ran down the closing stretch for Kansas State that got them to postseason play against the likes of Iowa State and Kansas. They won a 1-point game against West Virginia. Early in the season, after winning their non-conference games, they lost a nail-biter to Oklahoma State 36-34 and TCU by a touchdown, a game that I remember watching late in the game that they played extremely well. But then 55-0 against Oklahoma, lost by 14 points at Texas. Texas Tech put up 59 on Kansas State. I just think that athletically that they can't keep up with a fully staffed Arizona team on offense. So the Wildcats of Arizona win this one, in my opinion, as well. So we go 3-0 Pac-12 on that one. And I said ugly for the previous two matchups. We'll go with atrocious for the last two matchups. I don't know how we handicap this, although Colorado's getting better. Iowa State and Colorado, Nick.
Can I pick neither? I think that's the safe play here. Both of these teams really just were not good. Both of them fell off the face of the earth the last string of games. Colorado, I think they beat the likes of Colorado State and UMass and Oregon State maybe. Iowa State beat Texas and Kansas, I think probably is about it. I don't like either one of these teams. I would say, I guess Colorado did a little bit better against probably some tougher competition. But man, I don't like either one of these teams. I would say Colorado probably pulls out, but it'd probably be like a 13-9 game, and just a lot of sort of inexperienced, sloppy football.
I can't imagine anybody likes these teams, Nick. So, Caitlin, we got a matchup with 2-10 Iowa State taking on Colorado.
I think you take Colorado pretty handily. I know that we're laughing at it, but Colorado, believe it or not, to me, I feel like they were a better team than what their record showed. They weren't necessarily competitive in a lot of games in the Pac-12, but they weren't as walkable, I guess you'd say, as in years past. I think they definitely have a few players that are talented. When you're talking about Nelson Cruz and Kenneth Crowley, I think they're expected to get drafted this upcoming class. But I think Colorado would pretty easily win against this Iowa State team, who, in years, at least in recent seasons, I feel like every other year is upsetting somebody in the Big 12 that's on their way to winning the conference. But I think this season Colorado would this would be an easy win for them, which is rare.
Yeah, I think if we looked at the bottom 2 or 3 teams in any Power 5 conference and looked at their results from last season or any season, you would see these spurts of competitive play where you'd be like, oh, there's some hope. They only lost to this team by a touchdown or only lost to them by 10 points, but then they just get annihilated 2/3 to 3/4 of the time. And I'm looking at this Iowa State, and before I looked at the schedule, I had the same thoughts that you did in particular, Caitlin, that Colorado's been more competitive against better competition because I think the Pac-12 is better than the Big 12, regardless of the way these results will conclude here. I think there's a clear distinction between the two conferences. Iowa State, on the other hand, they played, and I remember catching the fourth quarter of this game against Iowa. They took the Hawkeyes to the limit, and it was 31-17 after they gave up a pick six. They gave, did they give anybody else a decent game? Oklahoma State 35-31. They gave Oklahoma State a decent game at 35-31. Kansas State, I don't know that we can chalk that one up because they're pretty marginal. But, man, they got annihilated by Texas Tech by 35. They lost to TCU by 24. They lost to Baylor by 18 points. So they did pretty much what you would expect them to do. Oklahoma beat them 52-16. I just think, like you guys pointed out, Colorado against better competition, competed better. I'm pretty confident that the Buffs win this game against Iowa State on a neutral field. And then it goes to an even lower depth when you talk about Kansas, who's completely inept, taking on an Oregon State team. Just got off the line with Oregon State head coach Gary Anderson, so I hope some people will check that out. The Beavers went 0-9 in the Pac-12. I was looking for the bright spots there. They competed against Stanford for about 3+ quarters and against Michigan for a half and played really well in Ann Arbor for a half. But Oregon State gave up a ton of points and yardage. They were like 115th in the nation against points and yardage defensively, and just had a revolving door at quarterback once Seth Russell got hurt. So Kansas and Oregon State, Nick.
Oh boy, Oregon State is not good at football right now, but they're not as bad as Kansas. In fairness, I think Oregon State wins included, I believe, Weber State and San Jose State, and then I think no one else. But Kansas couldn't beat anyone. I mean, quite literally, they didn't beat anyone. And I don't think they even got close at any point in the season. Oh, no, I'm looking it up. They came within 3 of San Diego State. So that's appears to be the highlight of their season. But, yeah, I like Oregon State in the future. I think they're going to continue to improve. I like Coach Anderson. But this would be an ugly game. But I just, if Kansas can't beat San Diego State, who can they beat, honestly, in the Power 5, I mean. So I would take Oregon State. It's not a game I would recommend watching, but I think Oregon State takes it probably by a score or 2.
I think Seth Russell came out of my mouth. I had Baylor on my mind. I obviously meant Seth Collins, starting quarterback for Oregon State, who has transferred leading into 2016. So I got to go with you, Nick, in regards to Kansas. You're talking about a new level, a different level of ineptitude when you talk about Kansas. So maybe Kalen surprises us and goes with an upset pick here. What do you have?
No, I'm going to go with Oregon State too here, guys. I think I caught one Kansas game, and I watched about a quarter, and I felt bad watching it. So Oregon State, for what it's worth, I mean, throughout the season, they, again, not necessarily competitive with teams, but, they give them fight. I didn't see any fighting when I watched Kansas. I think they played, I can't remember who they were playing. I think it was Kansas State, but it just hasn't been successful at all for them this season under Charlie Weiss. I have a lot more optimism with Oregon State's.
All right, I'll let you guys know that last week I had 3 Big 12 bloggers on. So we had 3 bloggers picking 10 games, including myself. So we had 40 game results between the Pac-12 and the Big 12, same exact seedings. And we had a 20-20 tie with all of us thrown in.
Really?
With the 3 of us, we have a 20-10 advantage for the Pac-12.
Interesting.
I don't think there's really a huge disparity there. I don't think that can be totally taken. I don't think there's a big surprise there, considering the source of those predictions. But yeah, I'm pretty comfortable with what we've got here. I think the depth of the league in the Pac-12 shows itself up when we start talking about these matchups. So 1 through 10 or 12, and obviously we had to take out, and I thought it was the most fair to take out the 2 middle teams in the Pac-12, being UCLA and Cal, so they're not represented there. And we mentioned last year that obviously the Big 12 did have some very shaky bragging rights, but nonetheless beat the Pac-12 2 out of 3 with the West Virginia win in the bowl game against Arizona State, another bowl game with TCU coming back inexplicably against Oregon, and then the Cal-Texas game with the missed kick for Texas down the stretch to give Cal the win, and the Pac-12 getting the win there. Stanford, Kansas State opening weekend, Arizona State, Texas Tech, Texas and Cal with a rematch at Berkeley. Those are the 3 Big 12, Pac-12 matchups for next regular season in 2016. Guys, I enjoyed it. This is fun to kick around.
Absolutely. It was great.
Appreciate it, Mark.
All right, good stuff. So for Caitlin Jones of House of Sparky on Arizona State's site for SB Nation, also Nick Dempsey representing Rule of Tree for Stanford, and Conquest Chronicles for USC on SB Nation's platform for USC and Stanford. This is our Pac-12 Breakdown Show. We come your way every Wednesday. So, guys, we'll catch up with you soon.
Sounds good. We'll see you then.
Sounds good.